obviously. I should actually tell you that I lived in a small town, if you're familiar with it, in Washington County called Clear Spring for over 30 years. I used to be the vice mayor there, and my husband was a former mayor, so I love small town. I love small town history. This is where America started, and I think what you have here is a group. And I'd like to compliment Kathy for trying to start this, and I think you need to keep your history. I think that's very important. So I am excited about today and look forward to maybe joining you on other future meetings.
Very good. Yes,
and
everyone.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Also wanted to introduce Sean Galloway from the Carroll Media Center. He's here to record our meeting again, but after a while you won't even realize he's here. Be sure to sign the sign-in sheet. We've got that going around. That way I can call you all and remind you about the next one, which will be at Pat Greenwald's home on River Road. Is it Salofa? Yes, that will be in April. No. Yes, April.
Does she have a balloon now?
We'll get directions. We'll get specific directions. So now I'd like to introduce our former mayor, John Herman. He is going to talk to us today about Baldwin Station. Good.
Okay. I moved to Sykesville in 1985 to restore the John Norwood house. It's on Norwood Avenue, the big house. And my goal was to spend about 2 years, renovate that house and the accompanying buildings, and then sell it and move on. Plans haven't worked out so well. I've been here for 20-some years at this point. But while I was living at the Norwood house, I came to find out that John Norwood was the railroad agent that lived upstairs in the train station when they built the train station. So while I lived at the Norwood house, at some point along the way, I was on a group called the Sykesville Improvement Association. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but it was Thelma Wimmer was on it, Katie Sandusky. There were a lot of local people who were on there. And what the Sykesville Improvement Association did was trying to figure out ways to fix up the town and make it a fun place to be. And the Sykesville Improvement Association identified this train station as an important part of the downtown, and they thought, wouldn't it be a great idea if we could fix up this building and have it as an anchor for all the renovation in the downtown. Thelma Wimmer was pretty much a driving force on the Sykesville Improvement Association. Because I was into renovation, I've been doing renovation for years, I offered my services to the town to be the project manager for this train station project. And we identified sources of funds and how we would do it and all that kind of good stuff. And we proceeded to work with the town of Sykesville, the town council at the time. We offered that we would, the Sykesville Improvement Association, would figure out a way to rehabilitate this building at no cost to the town. Okay? And that seemed like an attractive option to the town council because they didn't have any money and they've never had any money, and this seemed like a good idea. So they hired me to write the specifications, and while I was living in the Norwood house, I started working on this building. I brought along a couple of things that I'd like to read. One of them is the Democratic Advocate. It's dated September 27, 1884. Okay? And this was transcribed by Thelma Wimmer. And this is a description of this building being finished in 1884. The new Baltimore and Ohio depot at Sykesville, just finished and occupied, is the finest structure of its kind on the line of road outside Baltimore City. It is 90 feet long and 28 feet wide. 26 feet in the center is a 2-story high. It is 2 stories high. It is built in the Baltimore pressed brick and red mortar with sandstone sills and lintels and slate roof. The ticket and telegraph office is 10 feet by 13.5 feet, is between the waiting rooms. I don't know if you all recall, but there was a women's waiting room, and there was a men's waiting room. This was the women's waiting room, and just beyond there was the men's waiting room. They didn't want to mix up the men and the women, because the men were like spitting tobacco and whatever. And is elegantly furnished. Waiting rooms are 24 by 24. Ceiling is 14 feet tall. That sounds about right. And each have comfortable retiring rooms with water and all the modern appliances. I guess they're talking about the bathrooms. Okay. The freight room is in the west end and has double doors on 3 sides. A portico extends around the east side to the vestibule in the rear. I guess we're talking about that area there. It is protected by railings of unique design. A wide platform runs from this around the remainder of the building. The roof projects 6 feet supported by ornamental brackets. There are 5 small rooms in the upper story. If you've never been up there, that's where John Norwood had his apartment. There's a little kitchenette and some other rooms where he lived. Let's see. The upper flight, which are bordered, the whole building is well lighted by lofty windows, the upper flight of which are bordered with small panes of cathedral glass, which you see. Let's see. Cathedral glass. And the painting is red and chocolate with sage trimmings on the outside. The style is modern. This is the best of materials. It's used in construction. It is the only depot on the line that has a vestibule in the rear. Mr. E.F. Baldwin was the architect, and C. McLean supplied the building materials, and Vito was in charge of the work. But it is under the immediate supervision of A.J. Lincoln's foreman, and much credit is due to him under him and the different branches of trade. As no part of the work has been slighted, the grading, when completed, will give an avenue of 100 feet wide leading from the public road immediately opposite the rear entrance. Everyone except a few Howard County grumblers are delighted with the change.
Was that me?
And so I'll just give you a brief description of what the building was like when we started and how we raised the money for the building and so forth and so on. I'd be happy to answer any questions. But it was used by CSX as a storage shed. They had their trucks out in front, as many of you recall, and they had the mill next door, and there was always like this residue dust that settled on everything. And when we came in here, I remember very specifically, there was a big kerosene tank that sat over there, and there were all these drums all over the building, and it was a real mess. Excuse me. Let me turn this off. So, that being the case, we had to figure out ways to get money to fix up the building and do it for free, essentially, because the town didn't want to spend any money. So one of the things we did that was kind of interesting is we had an auction, and we had everybody in town that was interested in the building bring antiques and things that they wanted to auction. And then we hired an auctioneer to come here, and he stood on the steps over there, and he auctioned off all the stuff, and we raised money. We had lots of fundraising things. But one of the funny things about that auction was, as I said, I was responsible for doing a lot of this work. Well, my wife and I collected up all our valuable antiques and everything and brought them here in boxes and set them out. And the auction lasted from 10 in the morning till 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And at 4 o'clock, there were still a few boxes left that nobody had purchased or didn't pick up. Okay? So I was in charge of cleaning up. It turns out that the only boxes left were my stuff. So my stuff just wasn't that valuable. I guess, whatever. I felt very, like this is really poetic. Anyway, there's one other story that I'd like to tell you, which is somewhat interesting and relates to this. As I said, I was living in the Norwood house, and Johnny Norwood lived in this building, and he bought a very simple little cottage. There were 30 little cottages that lined from Oklahoma Avenue all the way up to Fairhaven. There were little boxes with 3 bays, little square buildings, and they were all identical. Well, John Norwood lived upstairs over here, and he bought the one on Norwood Avenue, and when he lived there, he built all these towers and cupolas and all that fancy schmancy stuff you see at the Norwood house, okay? And so, when I was there, I found, in the ceiling above the plaster, a hammer that he must have left underneath of one of these towers. And as I was doing all the work, and taking things apart, I kind of got a real sense about John Norwood's construction techniques, because when you're removing things, and you know that's a huge tower that sits on top of that tiny little building, and it's all plaster, it's all heavy, and all this stuff. So as I'm taking things apart, I could see how cavalier he was. He made his own trusses, and he did all this crazy kind of stuff. And you don't get to see that in a finished building, but when you're taking it apart, you really get a sense of the guy who was doing the work. And so I became somewhat, fascinated by Mr. Norwood's cavalier style. And there's even an advocate story that describes him as being like a 250-pound man working on this building and building all this weird stuff. There was another level on top of that second story, which sits on top of the Norwood house, that had a big spire and a ball at the top. And there were spires and balls and all kinds of crazy stuff that are no longer on that building, which made it even wilder looking than it is today. He also had a windmill in the back that pumped water out of a well. He had an ice house. He had all these modern conveniences, and Norwood was actually credited with several inventions that he patented. So he was a pretty interesting character. Okay, so I'm working on this building, and my job is to write specifications and raise money. And I come over here, and in the other restroom over there, under the sink, is this hose. And the CSX guys who were working here were very crude, okay? And so this hose had been dripping on the floor for maybe 10 or 15 years. And the floor joists under the floor were growing like fungus and mushrooms and things. And my job was to renovate the building, so I wanted this water to stop. Like I come in here and I go, look, you guys, you're really going to have to turn off that hose. They were using the hose in the afternoon to dust off their trucks, to get that, dust. They'd wash up their trucks. I say, you really don't need this hose. Come on, stop using it. And they go, yeah, get away. So I come back like a few weeks later, I'm still writing my specification. I said, I told you guys, you've got to turn up the hose. They go, yeah, get away. So the last time I come in, I say, look, I mean it. I've been here twice before. I've asked you, I've pleaded with you. The floor is soaking wet. The joists are rotting away. We're going to fix up the building, please. They go, yeah, sure, no problem. We'll see you later. Okay. So the next morning, I get a phone call. Okay, and the CSX guy says to me, did you come here last night? I go, no. He said, well, someone came here last night, took the hose, which was going out the front of the building, threw it on the train tracks and tore it up into little pieces. And they said it wasn't cut, it was torn. Okay? And so I go, I have no idea. It's a mystery to me. So the only thing I can figure is maybe the ghost of John Norwood, somewhat obligated to keep his building from rotting away. But what else do I have? I have here a couple of other things just as references. The Sykesville Improvement Association at the time, I had one of their newsletters. It was an interesting group. And I think I have it here. Let's see. Okay. The people who were on the Sykesville Improvement Association at the time, the president was Wiley Perky from Perky's Toy Trains. Bill Hall was the past president. Katie Sandusky was the recording secretary. Erica Brandenburg was the secretary. Jonathan Herman was the liaison officer, and Jim Schumacher was the town manager. And we all interfaced with the town government to acquire the building. The town ultimately got the building for $1 from the transfer from CSX to Farm and Home. And Farm and Home got the right to continue using that property up the road there. So it was the Chris family that owned the lease, so to speak. And that's basically my report. It was a lot of fun working on the train station. It was nice that we had identified this as like to be the anchor for the downtown area, because downtown at the time was kind of beat up and sort of empty, and it wasn't that attractive. And by getting the building and restoring the building, we kind of set a precedent and a standard for the rest of the revitalization in the downtown area. And as you can tell, over the last 25 years, a lot of work has been done in the downtown to preserve it and restore it. And the train station really has been sort of a model of what you can do with this private sector money was involved, public sector, but no town taxes were really ever levied to fix up this building. And in fact, there's been a steady income stream from the restoration of this building through the lease of Stuart Deary. So over the years, not only was the building renovated and restored, but it's been an asset to the downtown, and it's been a revenue source to the town, and continues to this day. And this is the model that we use for several other projects in the downtown area. Same thing with the Howard County buildings, the apple butter buildings over there. We acquired them with a lease from Howard County for $1, and we managed to get bond money to fix them up, grant money and things like that. We also used the same model for the Warfield complex, where we acquired the Warfield complex for $1, and it didn't cost the town anything. We were receiving money to fix it up as well. It's a nice model when government can direct things and use its resources to help clean up things and make it work. Same thing was with the new, what we call bank building across from the post office. We got a grant for $100,000 to fix up and move that building, and that seemed to be a pretty good plan as well. But as the project manager for this, we had really good people working on the different components. As a matter of fact, we had a gentleman from Germany, Gunther Kansen, who was the slate guy that did all the slate work. And he worked on a building next door to my house on Norwood Avenue, and I found him, and we were able to hire him. But he said as a young man growing up in Germany, you had to be an apprentice for many years before you were allowed to do roofing work. So he was very capable, and you know how the Germans are. They kind of get a little very precise, and he did everything very well. And it was nice having people like that, and getting the money and scraping it together and putting it and seeing it in use today is really nice. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about anything, or I'll just, yes.
When I lived here during that period when you did it, but I forget, when did it actually start to renovate this, and how long did it take?
Well, according to all my records here, it was like, we actually had a groundbreaking ceremony in 1996. So we started in, well, let's see, I can tell you, well, actually, it was a lengthy process. It happened in like little stages. So we started in about 1986, and we finished like the first phase pretty quickly, but then all the subsequent phases went on for years, because there's actually notes delineating 1988, so it went on for, I would say, 3 or more, maybe even 4 years. So it was done because we only had certain amounts of money. Like our first grant was $30,000, and the $30,000 was really designed to stabilize the structure, to keep it from taking on more water and cleaning up the creosote. And we had a lot of volunteers, which was nice. And there's a little plaque out in front, that brass plaque that tells you about the different people who donated money to the building. But it took several years, yes.
In 1941, there was no water in here. Only in the basement, that was a spring.
Really?
Yes, sir.
Wow.
Excuse me, I think this lady ought to tell us a little bit. She ran the station during the war.
I really didn't run the station.
Yes, you did.
I was married in 1941, and my husband was working here about maybe a year before that. So he worked, that little room right out there was the office, had a big desk, and the window that's there where the coat rack's at, there was a phone in it where the guys would come up, the trains would come up and stop there, and they would tell them they're going to back cars in or move around. And at that time is when the Springfield was getting loads of coal.
The dinky line.
Yes, sir.
That's neat.
And they would open that up and say, we've got 10 cars of coal. And during the war, apple butter was shipped out over here.
Really?
Mr. Renahan would come in with the seals to seal the car, and he would know how many cases of apple butter was in it. And Ted Barnes, that used to, his dad ran the pool room here, the first building where I think it's a Sun Spa or something. And Mr. Renahan would come in and know exactly how many cases of apple butter was in that car. No paper, no pencil. That was Mr. Sid Renahan. Lived over at the apple butter factory on 32 that burnt down.
Right.
This across the bridge was never an apple butter factory. It
I've
was
been told that.
a juice baby.
Packing house. We were scolded many times for calling that the apple butter.
But Ted Barnes actually, when he was in Germany in the war, ate Sykesville apple butter.
Your last name?
My name's Varner.
You should tell him the rest of your
You
story.
run the station while your husband was in
When my
service.
husband, we were married in 41 and moved over to the funeral home up in Sykesville over Weir Heights.
Okay, yeah.
And we lived there for 12 years and then moved over to Howard County. So I've been living in Sykesville since 1941.
That's pretty good.
And when my husband was drafted, I was working in Baltimore and at Hochul Cones downtown. Rode the train in and got the bus out to West Friendship. in
Rode the
evening.
train?
And when he was drafted, the B&O called me and asked me if I would run it. Well, everything then was handled by telegraph. The Western Union came into the window, well, there's a window on the other side, but it was a big desk where that coat room or whatever it is out there was at. And he was drafted in 43, and he was gone for 2 years. And when he came back, he bumped me out of my job.
You must have been getting good at it after 2 years.
He had seniority.
I couldn't,
He had seniority.
yes. And then he worked here until, I can't quite remember, it was 72 or 3. And Mr. Wilbur Bowler bumped him out of his job because he had more seniority.
Bowler
than
had
my
more
husband.
seniority?
Wilbur Bowler,
Wilbur did, yeah.
He came down from Gaither.
yeah.
That's interesting.
When
So,
the track men, at the time when I came in, it was Ham Hawkins that lived across the bridge over here. And he would walk to work every morning, him and St. Evans from up in Gaither. And before they went out, they had the hand car that they stored up along the track up there. Was a little building where they pushed it in right off the track. And it was like this. It wasn't electric. And before he would go out in the morning, he would bring me up 2 buckets of coal out of the basement and a bucket of water that I could wash my hands for the little bathroom on the other side, but it did not have a hose. I think actually the water in the basement was a spring head.
that's interesting. So I guess when they called these restrooms, because it says something in here about, well, this is a restroom. It must have been, was it a restroom in the day that you were here, or just didn't have any water?
There was a restroom where a restroom, but no water.
But no
The
water.
water was always carried, the trackman, and he always done that because he thought I couldn't carry a bucket of water, but I could. And at that time, this part here was just a storage room.
So you used to take the train from Baltimore to go to Hochul's to go to work?
Yeah, they crossed the track and got right on the train and rode into Baltimore, down at the Camden Yards.
How long did it take you to ride the train into Baltimore?
Oh, it wasn't long.
Is that right?
Maybe, not an hour,
It was all going
but that
down.
was when there was 2 tracks.
It was all going downhill.
How many stops did it make at Catonsville, Ellicott City?
It stopped at Ellicott City and,
Albert.
yeah,
Catonsville?
Albert.
Yeah, Albert.
Yeah.
There we go.
Hey, Todd, how's it
Very,
going?
very
Nice
good.
to see you.
Good to see you.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I don't have a question, but you seem so interested in the fact that
And he has no clue.
that she took the train into Baltimore. Well, my husband Neil had an aunt at Louise DeFreeze, and she was Louise Forthman. I've never understood why, but there was a group of young people here that went to Mount Airy to school. I don't know whether we didn't have a high school here then. I'm not sure, but they took the train to Mount Airy to go to school every day. And Aunt Louise would laugh because her mother was a very straight-laced Methodist woman, and of course Louise wasn't to wear makeup or anything like that, and her dress had to be very plain. Well, apparently some of her girlfriends would meet down here, and I guess they'd go into the restroom, and by the time they got back on that train, they were lipstick and mascara, and they had their, what is that flapper kind of clothes, and she would tell that story over and over again. But so when you ask about her going to Baltimore, I couldn't help but think
Well,
about Aunt Louise.
They had for a very short period of time, when they had the fall festival, they had a couple of excursions where you could get on the train and go to Ellicott City and then come back. And that was about the time that we moved here. I thought that was great,
Yes,
getting on the train.
yes, that was
It seems like, you have it right here. It's a nice thing to use, and it's kind of sad in the way that we don't use the train. In Europe, they use trains all the time, but it always kind of, I guess, seemed like a missed opportunity to have a train and not use it for any, passenger stuff.
I don't know why you couldn't do something like that as a money maker, maybe for the town of Sykesville, where you could offer dinners, or lunches, and people could buy their ticket and take a tour and eat.
It's actually a popular thing. They do that elsewhere throughout the country, but
Yeah.
trying to get CSX to agree to anything is nearly impossible. They won't agree. It takes months and maybe sometimes years just to interact with them. They're very, very difficult. They're worse than the federal government.
Thank you.
Really?
You had that issue with this station, didn't you, with CSX in southern states?
Oh yeah, there's a sort of a funny story where the people who were building the deck, the Psalms, were the first tenants for the train station. Jack Psalm and his wife Ellen, and they had hired a group of people to build this deck out here, okay, exclusive of my work. My work had been completed on the building, and then they were outfitting the building with some other things. Well, it seems that they built their deck 6 inches too far in that direction on the tracks. So they were like in certain areas 6 inches over the line where you're supposed to be, because you're supposed to be 25 feet from the center of the track, to wherever. And so we had to get an easement from CSX for that 6 inches, okay? And that took like 1.5 or 2 years. I mean, it was quite a process. And we have contacted CSX on numerous occasions to try and get that excursion to Ellicott City because it was so popular. And even though it was expensive at the time, it still seemed like a great afternoon. You go to Ellicott City, you do your shopping, you come back on the train. The kids loved it, and it's a beautiful. You go down through the Patapsco Valley, and it's just gorgeous. It's a wonderful train. And with all our concerns about gas consumption and transportation. And I'm sure they could build a train that was quieter and faster than this one. I think they say that because this only goes like 25 miles an hour, it wouldn't be that cost effective because you end up spending an hour on the train for a ride that takes a half an hour in your car. So they'd have to come up with like trains that have some kind of suspension to make those turns a little quicker or something. I don't know. But it's still fun. I don't even hear the train. I live just a block or so away.
You get used to it.
Yeah, I don't hear it at all. Everyone says, doesn't that train wake you up?
Well, I love to hear a train whistle, I just always do. And we hear it even out in Floraville,
Oh, yeah.
But I used to live right here in town, and
Wind's blowing
it
the
wake
right
me up, I just
way.
never hear it.
And you can hear the whistle stop. Here and also, what's the next one?
Well, yeah, we live on Oak Brook Road, and we can hear the train whistle down here and also
And that's the next whistle.
Gaither Road.
And at different times, if the clouds are low, you can hear it a lot louder.
There was a water tower at Gaither at one time. They used to stop up there and take on water when they had the steam engines.
I have a question. You mentioned about the upstairs. Where is the stairway, and is it accessible for tourists? And also the basement. I know there's an entrance outside, but
Those are a couple of good questions. The entrance to go upstairs is right there. You see that door through the window there? It's right in this little vestibule. It's kind of like a spiral stair, or, little stairway. Stewart has his offices up there. He doesn't keep it that neat, so he doesn't necessarily up there. But if you would give him, notice, maybe you could take a tour, because it's kind of cute. It's got those nice little windows, and you can see where the sink was, and the whole layout for that stuff. Underneath of the train station, there is a basement that's accessible from over there, and I think it goes as far as like this area. And then where the freight room is, there's a huge, like 12-foot ceiling in that basement. It's really tall, and it's really neat. It's got these big granite like blocks that they made the foundation out of. Because this, you'll notice as you're sitting here and the train goes by, the building doesn't shake a whole lot. This building is really built well. So we had at times considered the possibility of using the space under the freight room as additional seating or wine cellar or something, because it's such a formidable room. And previously, there was no entrance to the freight station from that center room. That opening in the wall was open later. The freight room was kept completely separate from the men's and the women's waiting room. But I always kind of like that image of the men, you know, with their spittoons, and the women all dressed up and looking pretty in the other room, not having anything to do with the men smoking and doing all their kind of stuff. Yes?
The other thing, when I was working here, I don't know if I want to say colored or black kids would come down here and wait in the room, in the waiting room. The other room was a freight room. We only had freight, and in order to unload the freight there on the wagon, and then they would load it in the other side, you have to go out the side, the front door there, where you come in at the bar. There was a door there that you went out and into the freight station. They didn't have a way in. And we only unloaded freight from that side, the front door, if it was small things. We used to get all the plants, tomato plants, and a lot of the food in for Springfield Hospital. And they would come down and load it up, and that was, I think most of the stuff that was hauled into Springfield on the dinky track was loads of coal. And every day they would go up and
That must have been quite a job, shoveling all that coal into the, you know, Springfield furnaces up there. Because all of Springfield Hospital was heated and, you know, the steam.
but that would go, that train, those coal cars would go directly to the power plant.
Right.
I don't know how they handled it, I never
Somebody
seen that.
must have been doing a lot of shoveling as far as
But,
I can
on the dinky?
That was the patients.
Track went right over the hopper, and dumped the car right in the hopper.
tell.
Yeah.
Anything else I can tell you?
No, you're talking about how they done the coal.
Uh-huh.
In Springfield, the train tracks run up right over top of the powerhouse, beside the powerhouse. And they had a big hopper.
Uh-huh.
They just opened the,
Oh, just opened it and went right in, self-feeding, yeah.
then the conveyor.
Right, right. And it went right across where 32 is between Northrop Grumman and Springfield Hospital was that
There's a
train.
little building there, right, where the Dinky engine used to sit in there, right where the water tank is.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a little building there.
That little
That's where they
building.
stored the Dinky engine.
Who ran that thing?
All correct, Paul Smith.
Oh, school.
And the dinky track, the overhead bridge on Spout Hill Road is part of that dinky track.
Right, yeah. Quite a change over the
48
years.
towns relief, it all was all town. It was all two on the firehouse.
So if you were handicapped, how would you
Huh?
Oh, yeah, well, when we renovated the building, we made it handicap accessible, okay? And there is a ramp that goes up there and comes across here and allows you to come in that back door over there. So it is, it has always been handicapped accessible. It just seemed that the laws had changed over the years, and there was a handicapped advocate that wanted the bathrooms to be better than they were when we had originally renovated. When we renovated the building, we were totally handicapped accessible to the regulations of the day, but the regulations have changed, and so now the building has a new, fully accessible handicap restroom at the far end of the building over there. So you can get your wheelchair in there and turn around. You can get your wheelchair in
don't
this.
have one yet?
Well, not specifically, but any person could get their wheelchair into this restroom over here, because we made it accessible. It just doesn't meet, there's a standard where you have to have a 5-foot radius to turn completely around. This one is fully accessible, doesn't have the 5-foot radius. The new one has the 5-foot radius, much to the challenge of the town to figure out a way to make that work. It is now fully compliant with all modern regulations.
Until they change it again.
Don't say that, because it'll drive Stuart crazy.
I think there ought to be more emphasis made on the freight that came in on rail. Because at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the away train that used the side rail that crosses the road up here. And all the feed for the feed mills and a lot of the hardware for the.
The lumberyard, there was a lumberyard, the Morrow hardware.
Yes, indeed.
Uh-huh.
All that came in on way trains.
Oh, that must have been really neat, because you can still see the tracks. You can see right in the middle of Main Street over there, those tracks going across.
And Mr. Harvey Cutsale had the feed store here where Southern States is now. And the cars, those buildings were built so that'd be the level of the freight cars. And they'd just open the side cars and the men would carry the feed off into those buildings, and sometimes they would sit there for 2 or 3 days.
That's interesting. And it brings up an interesting thought. When we were working with the state to improve things and do work, we had to talk to Northrop Grumman. Northrop Grumman owns half of the right to that dinky line. So it went across 32, and so when we were talking about modifying things relating to the dinky line tracks, Northrop Grumman was like, we don't want you doing anything with those tracks because at some point in the future we may want to use those tracks again for defense contracting. And so I'm thinking, yeah, that's likely to happen with Route 32. We're going to see the train, putting down the things, and anyway, so it's kind of an interesting point. But it is, I mean, having trains delivering freight is a big advantage. It's huge.
My father had a car dealership on the upper end of Main Street, and the cars even came in on the train.
Well, they had this thing on TV the other night where they were advertising for, like, I guess some train company saying that 1 gallon of fuel can take a train, like, so far, carrying tons and tons of equipment and things. So using trains for freight is a very practical, approach. And the fact
So
that we
why
don't
do
do
we
it.
have so many trucks?
That's right.
Well, that's what this advertisement was for, to get people thinking about, wouldn't it be nice if we actually started using trains again? We could save tons of.
Good farm.
They're also saying that it's a lot less, environmental. It has a lot less impact on the environment because you're only using 1 gallon to go, hundreds of miles with thousands of pounds of equipment. So it's actually a very practical thing. It's so funny. I don't know if it's funny, but as you watch America do things these days and you see the gridlock, and I'm sure you see it quite a bit, nobody can seem to agree to do anything. So we end up with, I guess the easier thing, which is to load up your truck and, carry everything. But it's a fascinating possibility.
The farmers along the valley here also ship their milk to Baltimore by train. The last one that I know that was still standing was Alec Cawthorn's down at Gorsuch Switch. His milk stand, when I was a teenager, was still there.
That is a fascinating idea. I mean, using CSX's track for more than just, how do you say, toxic chemicals would be good.
They needed 2 tracks here now. If they had 2 tracks, you probably wouldn't have any trouble then getting an excursion to go from here into Baltimore.
That's a good point. What also is fascinating, and I didn't know this until I became more understanding of how things work, but you know why trains are alongside streams and rivers? Because streams and rivers are always flat, so it makes things a lot easier. It's just an interesting thing.
I think that second track went away after Agnes in '72. Is that about right? Right time
Very
frame?
possible, yeah. But that's a good point. If you had a second track, you could really do something. Take a note on that,
Alan
please.
Louise Mitchell's not here, I don't think. Mr. Charlie Gaither used to work for the B&O in Baltimore, and he would come down in the mornings and ride the train to work, and he would bring cans of cream from his farm. I don't know where the farm was, but.
Down River Road, yeah.
And he would bring that up and load it. There was a little platform that went across the bridge right there, and then there was a waiting shed on the other side, right across the track. And they had a raised platform over there where he would come over and, he'd come in and set his cream up on that platform, and they'd load it on the same train that he rode into Baltimore with.
I was talking to someone who was telling me the story about how they used to sit up, I think it was Ron Bowler, okay, before he passed away. His father was the one who was the
Wilbur, yeah.
Wilbur.
Mrs. Ronnie's.
Well, Ron used to sit up on his father's shoulders, and they had some kind of hook or something that when the train would go by, they would pass it to the train as it was moving. They had like a bucket of, I don't know, something or like information or, so he said as a kid, his father was the railroad agent, and he remembered being on his father's shoulders with this like stick with a hook on the end of it, and as the train would go by, he would hand the railroad engineer.
Not here.
Not here?
It might have been up to Gaither.
Up at Gaither?
Or he worked, like my husband, they worked at all the different stations. Wilbur,
that was where the
Wilbur,
signal tower keys was.
yeah,
That was
It's
signal tower
probably-
keys where
yeah,
you
up
were.
at Gayford, he had a
They
little,
would give them messages.
Messages, that's it, yeah,
but
okay.
that was strictly telegraph.
Yeah, I was thinking that.
Yeah,
Well, it took care of the signals of the tracks too. But
Yeah.
They couldn't communicate with the train by telegraph while it was moving,
No.
right?
No.
Maybe this was how maybe they got the messages and then handed it to the engineer while he was moving along, so they didn't have to stop the train. But he just, for some reason, wanted to tell me that story. I had talked to Ron a while back, and he said he had such fond memories of the train.
but that had to be
Before
up,
two-way radio
he worked
was
at
all.
Mount Airy and, Woodbine,
Uh-huh.
probably it was up in there, but,
Yeah.
that didn't happen from 41 to 77 when we were here. My husband worked here until, I think it might have been 76 or 77, because he died 78.
When did they run, I think it was 1960s that they had still passenger traffic?
I can address that.
Yeah.
1949,
1949?
December 31st.
Is that
My mother
right?
got my sister and I up, went to town,
Uh-huh.
and we came back.
That was it?
That was it for passenger trains.
Wow.
And some of the
What
fellows,
year was it, Todd?
1949. Some of you remember Tom Forsythe, worked for the B&O. He was
Yes.
on the train,
Right.
and several others, and it was New Year's Eve, and they were happy.
Yes.
My sister and I and my mother got off here, but they went on off to the end of the line, so I don't know what happened way up there, but they were happy when they left
Well,
here. I
actually,
can tell you.
it went into Mount Airy and Harper's Ferry.
Okay. Point of Rocks, did he go up that far?
I think so, yeah.
I think that was more of a Washington
Was it? Okay.
branch, uh-huh.
It was 1949, last passenger train. That was it.
That's interesting.
Todd, you're telling on yourself. You're the last to ride the passenger train.
I was only 2 years old, I don't know how.
Share.
You were talking about the farmers hauling milk on the railroad. Well, they would stop to load the milk, but when they unloaded the can, they just opened the door and pushed them out, so they rolled everywhere. So that was, my father shipped milk in the 30s on the railroad.
That's interesting.
You talk about the speed
Uh-huh.
coming down here. If you think they're not flying, I was brave. I always wanted to hop a train. Because I'd stand here and watch the hobos going through. When the steam engines came, the water tower was in Gaither.
Uh-huh.
They were stopped taking on water, so I climbed on. Thought I'd jump off when we got down Sykesville. Well, by the time I got up nerve to jump off,
Uh-huh.
we were almost out of concession.
Yeah, walk back.
You talk, when you look down and see those tracks going underneath,
25
you
miles an
gotta
hour.
push off and get far enough away with that draft
Oh,
on those
yeah.
cars. I had gravel in my knees and my shirt was torn.
Well, in 1941, or when my husband was in the service, I used to get a phone call from Springfield, and a lot of the patients, at that time, they said they were notifying their families. And when we moved to Sykesville, almost all the patients in Springfield were from Hagerstown, and they were either alcoholics or actually men. And they would say a patient had eloped. And I didn't know what eloped was at that time. The patients would come down here and jump the trains and ride from here up to Cumberland or Hagerstown, wherever they were gonna go.
They used to have a big siren that would go off when the patient was.
Certainly.
They had a big siren up at Springfield. That was-
Steam whistle, steam whistle.
Oh, yeah, steam whistle. To notify everybody.
Also blew at 5 minutes to 7 and 5 minutes to 5. And, right, in the noon, and if there was a patient escaped, there was a signal, and if there was a fire, there was a signal.
There was actually a discussion just recently about reinstating that siren or whistle in case the patient escaped. But everyone said that's really too low tech. Now you got to get like email or cell phone, or, you know. But I kind of like the idea because every so often somebody takes a walk and it's nice for the community to know, if you hear a whistle or something, be aware, rather than waiting for a helicopter to, show up or something.
Well, they have 3 prisons, state prisons in Hagerstown, and they do blow a whistle to warn the neighbors if there's somebody that escapes, so that's not.
It is possible,
Yeah.
They were acting like it was too crude or something, but
Do
they.
you still have a problem with
Escapees?
hobos and drifters? And
Well, no, there's an interesting little story. There were 2 bars over here. Remember Duke's and Susie's?
That's
why they keep the
It's Gosnells and McDonald's first.
So we had what we call bridge people, okay? I don't know if you recall, but when I first moved to town, there was a bunch of people that lived under the bridge, okay? And you had Dukes and Susies over there. And they would, I guess, spend their days sleeping under the bridge and their nights over at Dukes and Susies, drinking or something. So, but we haven't had much in the way of hobos since we got rid of Dukes and Susies. That was kind of an interesting story. There, Howard County, the gentleman, Mr. Tisano, who owned the Apple Butter building, okay, wanted to be annexed into the town of Sykesville because he wanted to get water and sewer and improve his property. Well, Howard County, that's where it is, okay, didn't want to have any municipality in Howard County. You notice Howard County has no municipalities, okay? And had Sykesville annexed that portion of land, they would have had a municipality. They didn't want that. So what happened was, all these guys from Howard County showed up with their suits on and their lawyers and pointing their fingers, and they said, "We will buy up Dukes and Susies and tear them down if you don't annex that property." And we said, "That's a great deal, go for it." So they bought those buildings, and they spent a fair amount of money, and they tore them down, and subsequently we leased that property from Howard County. It was a good deal, but prior to that, we had all kinds of issues at Dukes and Susies. My favorite story was there was a gentleman who was on trial for shooting someone at point blank range, right between the eyes, okay, at Dukes, okay? And his defense was, "I was trying to get off a warning shot."
Did it work?
I remember not too many years ago that I was over here at the Southern States, and I said, there's a fire over there by the tracks, and lots of smoke. And they say, "Oh, that's just the homeless, don't worry about them." And I had no idea that people at that time, and this wasn't very long ago.
No, it was.
That's how they kept warm in the winter.
There was a little community living underneath.
Yeah, that's what they said. I
Yeah.
had no idea.
I'll have to say this first, because it wasn't always Dukes and Susies.
Yeah.
It was at one time, and I remember this, because I was just little, and I wasn't allowed to go, but my father would bring food back for us. It was Gosnells. They had the best seafood
Oh, they did.
that you will ever put in your mouth, and I mean today, and I think they took all their recipes with them when they passed away. So it
So
wasn't
it
always.
was nice establishments for a while. before
It
turned
was,
into
it
Dukes and
was
Susies.
Gosnells and McDonald's. Now,
Yeah.
McDonald's was a little on the rougher, that's where the rough people went.
That was the
But
second.
but the refined Sykesville.
Went down because you could walk to it.
But I also want to bring up a point, since you're bringing up the homeless. You know who I'm talking about when I say Father Jim Perman.
Sure.
And when he first came here as a priest for St. Barnabas, the reason I know this, I was a hairdresser in the area, and I did his wife's hair. And I had so admired that man, because he took his ministry right down under the bridge. He took his ministry behind Gosnells. And I always thought that that was just the most wonderful thing, because he could have been very pomp and pious and not even wanted to look at what was going on right under our noses here, but he ministered to those people, and I'll never forget that.
He was an extraordinary person.
Yes, he was.
Sure.
Yes, he
One
was.
Palm Sundays, what she's talking about, one Palm Sunday, of course, I was just old enough to drink. They came in the dining room door of McDonald's. They brought the whole congregation, I don't know where they were from. but they gave everybody who was standing at the bar a palm. Piece of palm. They come in the dining room and went out the bar door. The whole congregation walked right there too. And everybody in the bar a piece of palm. Palm Sunday.
Yes.
When Gene Gosnell operated his establishment over here, he had wonderful seafood, but I remember in the men's room, next to the river, there were holes in the floor and you could see the river running, you know.
Well, you could do
in
that
the men's
in
room.
the stores.
You could do that in any of the stores.
Yeah, that storm drain, you know, it wasn't until they put the storm drain, and that wasn't that long ago, that there was a drain that went right under all the buildings on there.
Yes, that's right. It wasn't river water that was going down through there.
But it went straight down.
You didn't sit there.
Yes, it
for
did.
long.
It made a great place to fish right at the end of the
You know, actually, that does bring up an interesting point. You have all these places like Spout Hill and Springfield Avenue, and on Spout Hill, there's water that runs all the time. And it was upsetting the road for years and years and years, until we finally put like something under the road to capture that water. But people would come out here from Baltimore, and this is a really interesting concept. When they first started the railroad, there were people in Baltimore that would come out here in the summertime to go to the cottages that were built by Governor Brown, the little Norwood houses, those little square little boxes. Like you see, the one that I restored up on Oklahoma Avenue was one of those little tiny boxes. It was only one room deep and had 3 windows across, and there were 30 of them that littered the landscape. But just imagine this concept, that in the 1880s in Baltimore, you had horse-drawn carriages in the city, okay? You had all that horse poop and everything in the city in the summertime. It's 95 degrees. You had no screens on the window because they didn't have screens. All you could do was have lace curtains and things. You can just imagine the flies and the heat and the desire to hop on a train and come out to a nice place like Sykesville in the country, where you had Spout Hill and Springfield Avenue, and if you fished upstream a little bit, you could actually have a decent time of it.
They had a hotel too.
A hotel, yeah. So this was a real happening resort, and it's really easy to understand when you think about Baltimore City with all that congestion and heat and no air conditioning and the humidity and the smell. It must have been tough to be in the city in the summertime. So places like Sykesville were really quite attractive. It's kind of nice to imagine. And there are a couple of good photographs that show. And what's really fascinating is that when you see these little cottages sprinkling the landscape, there are no trees anywhere. They completely took down all the trees. All the trees that you see in the Patapsco River area over here, they weren't there. In the 1890s, they had taken all the trees out everywhere. There's maybe like 1 or 2 trees in front of people's houses. But everything that you see here is grown up within the last 100 years. There's nothing really old. So when you see these old photographs of Sykesville, it's all just big fields.
Well, the house up on the curve where a main street goes up Springfield Avenue, that house right there, people by the name of Dixons used to live there when we were over the funeral home. And there's a spring head there, and it hadn't been too long ago, it looked like they capped it off. It's the house that sits right on the curve. Close to the big-
Audie Klett was the last one to live there recently.
The Haynes lived there.
Yeah.
Katie Springer's got a spring head in her basement.
Huh?
Katie Springer has a spring head in her basement.
Yeah.
There was a lot of attraction in the 1890s about spas and places to go where there was water and springs and all that kind of stuff. So it's and even when I work in the city sometimes and I come out to Sykesville in the evening, it's always 10 degrees cooler out here because of all the trees and the grass and everything, without the buildings and all. So it's an attractive place to come to. Yes.
So was this a summer destination, are you saying?
Well, it was both. It was actually, because the farming community, that's what really, one thing kind of led to another. With James Sykes having his mill on the other side of the river, I think that was an attraction to the railroad to stop here, but the other real attraction was the farming community needed a place to send their goods. So this was first, in my opinion, viewed as a commerce thing, and then secondly, it became attractive to, Governor Brown, who built all these cottages, was thinking of this concept, because when they had the 30 cottages, they were connected by a boardwalk that led to a central dining hall. So they weren't designed to be full year-round houses, they were designed to be summer cottages. So Governor Brown in the 1880s. I mean, so the railroad and James Sykes really happened first, and then you have this agricultural community that needs to ship its goods, and then secondly, it became like a vacation destination because it was so nice and there was virtually nothing around here. So.
That's funny because I think Catonsville, excuse me, was also like that, and so was Glendon. Glendon started out as Tabernacle and,
Christian community.
yes.
It's still over there.
Still is.
Oh, yeah,
It
yeah.
is.
Well, they still have Emery Hotel.
Emery
and-
Grove.
Emery Grove
Right.
and Minnehaha is a spring on that property. It's interesting how they parallel us. You know, the further you got from the city, but we did the same things.
Well, and what's also fascinating is that if you think about the river, and James Sykes, there was James Sykes using the river for his mill, you know, to get the power, and then there was the Elba furnace down there that I think used the mill, used the water as well for some sort of a power source. And now that people are looking at alternative energy sources, people have been thinking about, well, is there anything we can do with the river to generate electricity and save ourselves some money? So we're actually going full circle. Trains are coming back, and river, you know, hydropower and wind power, all those things from the 1800s are actually becoming attractive again. And, you know, this is really fascinating. You look at bank barns, okay? And bank barns are all facing south, okay? And the backs are all north where it's earth burned. So you have this earth in the back which protects the lower section. You have the south coming in like this. It's like people are starting to realize that certain things that we did hundreds of years ago were just practical. In fact, I have a great little analogy. I had this black Labrador retriever, okay? The sweetest dog in the world. Wasn't very bright, okay? We loved him, he was great. In the wintertime, because he was black, he would sit out in the sun, okay, and get warm. And I'm thinking, you know, with all our technology and ingenuity and everything, we still have been building houses that don't face south and don't take advantage of the natural, you know, way the world works. But my dog, who is as dumb as a rock, had figured this thing out.
Right.
So it's kind of...
Cross ventilation, the doors.
Yeah. There was all sorts of stuff that we were doing that's now becoming popular again. And the train, I always thought the train was a huge asset, and if we could actually get it to do something other than, you know, just come and go past it, it would be wonderful.
Well, that was the only way people had, my grandfather used to ride to Baltimore. I've got a little trunk that he used to put his clothes in, and ride the train to Baltimore and visit relatives, what have you. And Mom lived on a farm, and she said the relatives would come out there on the weekends, because it was nice out here in the country, and they could get a good home-cooked meal, you know. They could out and visit on the weekends.
It's kind of interesting. Yes?
You're talking about using openings to the south for your heat in the summer, winter time. Senator Jim Clark over here in Howard County, son Mark built an earthen house on the farm with it open to the south, and everything to the north had 2 feet of earth on it.
And that's what all bank barns are. You know, it's just sort of natural stuff. It's kind of funny that things that are so obvious are becoming popular again. And earth-sheltered buildings are becoming big, green buildings. And it won't be long before we figure out all sorts of other simple ideas.
I would like to add one thing in here. If Kathy, as this group leader, you don't have anybody from the town council here, do you? Right now. I think if you would check that idea with the council, and if they're interested in pursuing what a train, an excursion train can do for the town or something, and write to Senator Mikulski, you have my card. We will try and connect you with somebody from CSX to come in and maybe look at that
We have a Main Street
possibility.
manager who creates all kinds of activities and
Well, we need to
festivals.
hear from somebody,
Right.
you know, officially.
I can get you more information.
Okay, we'd be happy to do that.
That'd be great, because it's really a wonderful opportunity for the town.
Senator Mikulski says we can always promise the effort, we can't promise the outcome, so I'd be happy to do that.
Jonathan, who owns the right of way where the think it used to be?
It's owned by the state of Maryland, and a portion of it is shared with Northrop Grumman along Northrop
Right.
Grumman's property. But it's there's a reversion clause in all the easements in the 1890s or whenever they, or 1880s when they drafted up these things. It said that it had to be in use, and every individual property owner along the dinky line has a separate deed, and they're all unique. So, but the state of Maryland is actually the owner of the dinky lines land.
Even though it hasn't been operational for 20 years?
It hasn't been operational for a lot more than 20 years, but
I know.
I guess the point being is that no one that I know has ever tried to recoup their dinky line property, because the town had looked at making that into like a hiker-biker trail and other things like that. And Northrop Grumman was very adamant about they didn't want to give up their right to that line because of defense contract and that they may need it in the future, but I don't see that's ever going to happen. So it's mostly the state of Maryland and Northrop Grumman that have rights to it. But it is,
Does that come under the law of adverse possession?
I mean, someone needs to look into that. I always thought it would be nice to get back my property, which is like right on the dinky line. So, but I haven't done it, I don't think anyone else has. And everybody who has property on the dinky line has, you know, concerns and, you know, issues and stuff like that. Because it goes over several roads. You know, over there by Tom's gas station, there's a road. And on the other side, there's a road by the middle school, and then you got Route 32. So I can't imagine they're ever gonna start the dinky line again. Yeah, Spout Hill, they'd have to rebuild that iron bridge. And
What's the condition of the bridge?
it's not good, I can tell you
I
that.
imagine it's not good. It's been there a long time.
I'd like
I
to see.
noticed the houses off of Brown Street and Central Avenue made back entrances by using the.
Oh, everybody is filled in on top of the dinky line.
Right.
I actually, when I was living in the Norwood house, up on top of the hill was the old ports had chickens, okay?
Right.
They had pigs up there too, on the other side of the tracks.
And I got news for you, where the pigs were, is some of the most fertile ground in all of Sykesville. But where the old chicken coop is, okay, we fixed up the big house on Norwood Avenue, and then later we fixed up the chicken coop into our house and we lived there. And we, as well as everybody else, pushed some dirt onto that dinky track, okay, to kind of spread out our backyard. And I would have nightmares that I hear some noise, and there'd be a crew of CSX guys with shovels, you know, and a big train, you know, like in the background, ready to come past my house, but I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, there's so much obstacles in the way with roads and, you know, everybody's backyard. And then Bob Hall actually cut all the dirt away from that area. I mean, there's some scary stuff going along the dinky line where people have modified and added on, and, you know, so you really couldn't get the dinky line working again. It would cost you millions and millions of dollars. We better spend putting that second line going to Baltimore, that high-speed, you know, train.
How many trains actually go through here a day?
It's anywhere from, like, I don't know, I'd say an average of 10.
Really?
As many as, somewhere in that range, 8 to 10.
Has that increased recently, or?
It varies. I mean, because I don't really pay attention to it anymore. They just kind of come and go. But some days you could be sitting here having lunch, and 2 or 3 trains could pass all in the course of an hour, and they're going in different directions and things. So there was somebody who was actually tracking this to see what it is, and getting any information from CSX would be monumental. So if you want to have a pet project.
Security, they won't release information.
They are very
They
difficult
wrote
to
me a
deal
letter
with.
telling me.
Is that what it is?
I finally inquired, because so many people ask me all the time.
What do you?
I finally, after years, said, I've never really checked. Maybe they'll tell me. Homeland Security.
And they
Won't
also
give the information out.
They also have like rules, like they can do things that anybody else can't do. They can dump things into the river, they can suck water out of the river, they can do all sorts of, they're exempt from all kinds of EPA regulations and stuff. What we found out when I was mayor is that they would never respond to us or talk to us or anything. And the only way to get them to respond was to create an emergency that they had to respond. So like they have their little storage, their maintenance shed up the road there. Well, if you want them to talk to you, just block their storage shed and they can get into it, and you'll hear from them in 10 minutes. What's that?
I have a key.
The other thing we had to do, we were working on tearing down the sheds that used to be between here and up the tracks there, the big old, you know, the mill sheds, and there were some electric wires that had to be moved, and one of those wires was going to affect the lighting on the tracks, you know, the track lights, And so we were trying to contact them, no results. So finally I said, Matt, just call them up and tell them we're cutting the wires. And, you know, they'll come out right, and immediately they responded. Like we said, on Wednesday, you know, so-and-so, we're cutting the wires, and they responded. But otherwise, if it's not an emergency, they won't talk to you. And then if they do, they'll send you to like 3 or 4 different places, and you end up having to talk to somebody in Florida, and they don't respond to your phone calls.